By the 1970s, the horror game genre spanned across all major platforms, from 2 generations of home consoles, to arcades, to desktop and mainframe computers. Commercial general-purpose digital computers that can store programs and games for them had been around since at least the early 1950s. The 60s advertised compact and affordable mini-computers, and in the 1970s, surged in popularity in what is referred to as the microcomputer revolution. After a 1968 breakthrough, resulted in things becoming even tinier, and soon more affordable. Alongside them, commercial video games, which had arguably also been on the market since the 1950s, had finally become mainstream, which is a phrase that almost gives me PTSD with how annoying people used to be about it. But by the 1970s, video games were mainstream entertainment so large that within just 3 more years, they would be considered bigger than Hollywood and pop music combined. So you could imagine by the 70s, home computers were of course already made with developers in mind. For the average Joe simply wanting to play video games at home in the 1970s, consoles being streamlined home and portable personal computers made for that purpose would be the way to go, which is probably why so many did, and that history is often celebrated. But I'm curious about the landscape of desktop computers. I'd like to take a look at this microcomputer revolution from the perspective of its horror games. This revolution is often attributed as starting in the early 1970s when Lakeside High School students Paul Allen and Bill Gates commonly sought access to computers, even being banned from seemingly more than one place, like Computer Center Corporation, where they exploited a bug to get additional free computer time. They would form the Lakeside Programmers Club to make money working with computers, including for the center that banned them. After high school, they'd go to different colleges, and Paul Allen would drop out to become a programmer for Honeywell. A week before Christmas of 1974, a new issue of Popular Electronics would drop, showcasing a new player in the microcomputer game, the Altair 8800, using the new Intel 8080 whose predecessor Paul and Bill worked with in their younger years. Inspired to start his own software company, he would contact the computer maker about software and convince Bill Gates to drop out of Harvard to join him in making an interpreter for basic programming language to run on it, forming Microsoft. Paul flew out to deliver what they made and showcased it by playing some version of the 1969 game Lunar Lander. The 8800 would become a popular PC to the point of being credited as the start of desktop's leap in popularity during the 1970s, which is what people refer to as the revolution, as opposed to the 1968 breakthrough itself. And on July 15th of 1979, a horror game would be written for it. A fan fiction set in the world of the works of famous Rhode Island author, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. And I sure don't know how any of these things are supposed to be pronounced. But Kadath tells the story of said world Yadath, being in danger of the return of a precursor civilization, whom a stone tablet you find in an archaeological dig prophesizes will return when the stars align correctly. You have set out to find the Eye of Kadath, a gem thought to be powerful enough to destroy the gateway from which they would enter, which you plan to do by cracking open the eye to unleash its power. Kadath framed its writing seriously, and had content I found more visceral than previous games of its genre. Despite infamous typos, I found it well written, though it's not my taste in horror. Gameplay, however, I found to be an improvement through its use of multiple choice actions instead of making the player figure out what to type. Depending on how you feel about text adventures, you might find this to be a downgrade, or if you find figuring out what to type in a text adventure horror in itself, you might see it as a relief. This game would also not remain exclusive to the 8800 and be brought to future home desktops. You see, when a now famous hacker by the name of Steve Wozniak was working at Hewlett-Packard, his friend told him he should meet a high school student by the name of Steve Jobs, who likes electronics and playing pranks. At the time, Wozniak was inspired by an article in Esquire magazine about blue boxes that emulated the sounds phones make to connect people, therefore allowing you to hack free calls. He wanted to make his own, and Jobs wanted to sell it. Selling them for $150 each, splitting the profits, this would be the dynamic people remember of the two Steves. Woz knows how to make the tech, and Jobs knows how to sell it. What I always remember, though, is how Jobs believed his vegetarian diet ensured he wouldn't produce body odor, and thus he wouldn't have to shower, which his coworkers at Atari didn't seem to agree with, causing them to quickly put him on the night shift, which didn't exist, meaning he'd come into the building when everyone was gone, and be able to bring Wozniak in to get things done. His boss Nolan Bushnell was aware, but didn't really care, because as he put it, he got 2 Steves for the price of 1. He did offer Woz at least one bonus, but through Jobs who hid it from him. Woz would eventually make a computer for his homebrew computer club, and after his workplace was uninterested in buying it from him, Jobs convinced them they should start their own company and sell it themselves. After this 1976 computer referred to as the Apple I would find good success, the Apple II the following year would become sought after by aspiring video game developers as a desktop made for making video games. It shipped with an interpreter made with hobbyists and game devs in mind that allowed users to immediately write software without additional stuff needed. Now, don your thinking beard for this one. A question I've pondered is the Venn diagram of considering something in the stereotypical old European fantasy setting and something being considered a horror game, because there are a lot of games like 1979's Dungeon of Death, which are considered to be horror games, that I never would have thought of as horror games. I'm curious what percentage of people consider which of these to be horror games. From that first-person dungeon crawler Puyo spawned off from, to Baldur's Gate or Untold Legends. Because there's no wrong answer to me. I just noticed it's a far higher percentage than I thought. I bring all this up because one of the people to make games for the Apple II was soon-to-be famed Ultima creator Richard Garriott, just 2 years before Ultima. It apparently started as a high school project he made on a school computer, which was one of 28 fantasy games he made in high school, before getting his hands on an Apple II and making the more fleshed-out version, Akalabeth, World of Doom. And I can see how its cover sets a tone that carries over into the first-person dungeon crawler featuring hooded figures and the general tension of running into danger while exploring, especially in a first-person game. Picture Zelda 2 where there's a top-down overworld and side-scrolling dungeons. This is like that where there's a top-down world to explore with towns and mountains, while dungeons are explored in first person, which was inspired by the 1978 game Escape. The worlds are randomly generated, asking you for a world seed so you can always get the same world if you use the same seed, technically meaning you can collaborate with other players by sharing knowledge as you learn specific worlds. The game takes place in the aftermath of British, the bearer of white light, having driven off the Dark Lord Mundane, who spread evil to the land. Now, arguably you don't have to, but the game recommends you to search for the castle of Lord British, who will task you with slaying various monsters located through these dungeons, who are remnants of the Dark Lord. Apparently Richard Garriott was working at Computerland at the time, which was a computer store chain in the 1970s, and showed the game to his boss, who told him they should sell it in the store. So he had his mother draw a logo to sell the game in Ziploc bags, which is the version of packaging I'd like to see. But it eventually got the attention of California Pacific, who contacted him wanting to publish it professionally. Back in 1975, however, electronics company Commodore was beginning to run into a concerning situation when, to compete with the lowering prices of calculators, Texas Instruments entered the market itself, antiquating those they sold chipsets to like Commodore. Realizing the calculator game is over for them, they would attempt to jump onto the hype of the microcomputer revolution and look to the Apple II to sell, but considered Steve Jobs' offer too expensive, so they decided to make their own computer. The Commodore PET was named after the 1975 pet rock craze, for their goal of making a pet computer. Despite being cited as releasing in January of 1977, this seems to only be the date of a Consumer Electronics Show appearance it made after its 1976 announcement, but perhaps people could start placing orders at this point. Whenever orders could start being placed, they'd be sent out in late 77, starting with developers and magazines in October like Byte, who would later be credited with referring to it as part of their famous trinity of 1977 desktops, alongside the Apple II and Tandy Radio Shack Z80. While all three of these computers licensed Microsoft BASIC, having one video game run across all of them did not seem so basic. Ports for games could be years apart, sometimes changing game content and even names, like the Commodore version of Kadath, Eye of Kadath, seemingly being far more abridged. I've seen some people refer the more condensed Eye of Kadath, and there can be a strength to the short and sweet format. An example being 1979's Haunted House, a common name for a game, which wants you to escape said haunted house by midnight. But it's full of so much danger that you may find yourself trying new things across multiple playthroughs, with your eye also on the clock ticking down to midnight, assuring runs don't last too long, even if you avoid the densely packed danger. It encourages a form of running the game in short, sweet trial-and-error attempts that make it easier to approach, and just try again on a different day, with short play sessions alleviating a bit of concern for how much time you have to set aside. Its writing style is brief, expecting to be repeated instead of approaching writing more like a horror novel as Kadath does. There's also what I find to be a middle ground to these two writing styles, and a series that has stood the test of time, as fondly looked upon desktop games of the era. Scott Adams had been making computer games since the 1960s, and as early as 1975 was working on home computers. In '78 he would make a game called Adventureland that would find success, and the following year, he and his wife Alexis would found Adventure International, continuing to make these games. Number 4 in this series would be Voodoo Castle, dedicated to all moms, and solely credited to Alexis Adams. Though Scott as early as 1981 saying they both worked on it, contrasting with Alexis's wording in a '98 email, has led to a mini drama over proper credit. The game itself is about you attempting to rescue Count Cristo from the slumber result of the voodoo curse his enemies hexed him with. You begin in a room with Cristo lying in a casket. From here you can explore the residence, which I assume to be the Count's, as you can run into a maid who doesn't seem to fear you as an intruder, leading me to believe you are someone who knows the Count, looking for something in his spooky dwelling to break the curse. This game is not too tense, but there is the fear of comically being your own undoing, like trying to experiment with the lab chemicals and they blow up in your face, or simply examining an open cell in the dungeon and the door closes behind you, accidentally trapping yourself. I can see the appeal of having a simple spooky themed puzzler like this, but was truly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Something that always stuck in my mind was Tim Schafer remarking how Sandover Village in the first Jack feels like a real town where people live, which creates an effect of dreaming or thinking about wanting to go back and hang out there when you're not playing the game. It made me realize the deliberateness of making a world capable of building a relationship akin to a hometown with the player, as opposed to just being a setting you happen to develop nostalgia for after playing a lot of the game. I only played this game once, and in the days that have passed since I last played it, I've been having that feeling Schafer was talking about, thinking about seeing into the chapel from the room to the south, or how I imagined them, because I played the text-only version of the game, with the environments leaving that positive an impression on me. But I think what really made this game work for me is that it had a simple 2-word rule for typing things in. I can't tell you how intimidated I am by text adventure games, but simplifying it to that made it very approachable, at least to start off with and explore around without being immediately scared off. The next game number in the advertised Adventure International series would have you on the other side of a count, with you attempting to defeat Count Dracula. After awaking in a bed in Transylvania, you must survive days, trying to remain unhunted by Dracula, to hunt him yourself. This game of Predator versus Predator felt very tense. There was a spy versus spy tension of me trying to sleep in fear that he'll get me overnight, me losing an item, or even Dracula finding out what I plan to use against him. A 1981 review for this game in Space Gamer mentions using a tent stake as a weapon, but it's far from as simple as running at the supernatural being. It's a puzzle game with the added element of having this supernatural wumpus somewhere in the castle, outsmarting you to make you his prey in an instant, as you try to do the same back. I may not like puzzle games, but this is a cool idea. I used to be too intimidated by the fear of obtuseness to play these kind of games, and while I may still prefer an action list like Kadath, the illusion of seemingly infinite possibility of just being asked, what do you want to do with the text box, including the satisfaction of being surprised when something you type as a joke works, is not lost on me. Simpler games, of course, make it more approachable, and I can imagine the bang for your buck of thinking about a way to progress in a game and coming back to it for a long time, trying to make progress without losing interest in the novelty of doing it on your versatile machine that you want to play with. I'm Oktar.